Hello everyone, my name is Philip Officer and I'm here today to talk about a very controversial topic when it comes to our nation's history. A controversial topic is John Brown. Now, as we find ourselves in the 150th anniversary of the American Civil War, we are now entering the second year of that conflict, what will be 1862. Yet we must remember that almost 152 years ago, a man named John Brown came to this very spot, to Harper's Ferry, to decide the fate of slavery. It's all too easy sometimes to forget the central issues and the causes of the American Civil War, but as our theme is in fact Civil War to Civil Rights, it is important to remember John Brown's raid. And before we get started, I want to make one thing very, very clear. What I'm going to talk about today, John Brown, his actions, are not my own personal opinion. It's not my personal sentiments of John Brown. It's not what I think John Brown did. It's not what I think John Brown said. It's not what I think about what John Brown did and said here at Harper's Ferry. It is simply what happened, when it happened, who said it, why they said it, when it happened, why it happened, and so on and so forth. Now, a little background information. Slavery had been going on for almost 400 years in the American continent. At the time of John Brown's raid here in Harper's Ferry, there are about 4 million slaves in the South. 4 million. Now that's about 1 in 8 in terms of the total national population of the entire United States. 1 in 8 civilians. Now I want you to look around when you walk outside next time in a crowded place. And I want you to count off 8 people. Now imagine that one of those people would be enslaved in this particular time period. You can begin to grasp just how serious the issue of slavery was. There's only 9 million people in all the southern states. 4 million of those are enslaved in this time period. And John Brown has decided that enough is enough. John Brown has decided that the United States is morally bankrupt, can no longer be counted upon itself to get rid of slavery by its own. He must do it for them. He has amassed a band of 21 men. 21 men. And he will push into the South. He has written a new constitution for the United States. He is, in fact, in his mind, starting the Second American Revolution. And in so doing, he will create a brand new country on this particular land that we call home today. First and foremost, in his land, slavery is abolished. To do this, he will do it by force of arms. Not necessarily a new concept in the American continent. What is different in this case is that it is a white man leading a band of men southward to destroy slavery. He will push into the South. He will destroy slavery state by state, county by county, town by town, house by house, and bed by bed, if necessary. Now, why does John Brown come to Harper's Ferry? Well, that's a very easy reason. It's a very easy thing to say. It's a very easy reason. For the simple fact that Harper's Ferry is the southern armory and arsenal of the United States. At Harper's Ferry, there are 100,000 firearms stored in 2 arsenal structures, 2 two-story brick buildings that hold over 100,000 firearms. Now that's a lot of weapons, especially for this given time period, considering that Harper's Ferry only produced 10,000 weapons per year. So why are there so many weapons in the land in Harper's Ferry at this time? Well, what we suppose is, in fact, that they were turning old flintlock systems, the old technology, into the new technology of the day, which is percussion cap instruments. John Brown has his crosshairs fixed upon those 2 arsenal structures, has his eye on those 100,000 firearms, and he decides that Harper's Ferry is the perfect place to start his second American Revolution. Now he comes into the area and he takes up the name of Isaac Smith. And with the name of Isaac Smith, what he presents is a story. Isaac Smith, mineral prospector, not an uncommon occurrence in this area. People have been prospecting for minerals in the hills around Harper's Ferry for quite some time, to little or no avail. So the idea that a mineral prospector in this area is not an uncommon occurrence. He rents out a farm. And he proceeds to gather his men and weapons. On the night of October 16th of 1859, John Brown walks into the dining hall of this little farmhouse that he has rented, and he says to his men, "Men, get on your arms." we shall proceed to the ferry. His 21 men gathered on their arms, filled up a wagon with supplies, and marched the 6 miles from the Kennedy farmhouse to Harper's Ferry in the dead of night. His men would later state that it was like a funeral dirge. Not a single man spoke. When they get to Harper's Ferry, they take the night watchman on the bridge. Now notice I said the night watchman, not the guard. There were no armed guards in this town. You may ask, why at a federal installation where they are holding federal weapons are there no armed guards? Very simple reason for this. The guards that were out were fire watchmen. It was their job simply to make sure the army buildings did not catch on fire. It was not their job to prevent outside assault. The simple reason for that was that no one in their mind had ever anticipated that someone would possibly assault a federal installation in the dead of night, especially to arm slaves. Now, John Brown did not come unarmed. He came with modern weapons at the time period, Sharps carbines, easy action reloader, reach-loading weapons, in which case you could load them faster from the rear. Instead of the usual 3 shots in a minute, you can get off 6 shots in a minute, or more if you were slightly faster. Now, he also brings with him several iron pikes, 950 iron pikes. Now, why would he bring an iron pike? We get this question a lot. Why bring a knife to a gunfight? Very simple reason for this. Why bring a knife to a gunfight? Well, if you are an African American in this time period, free or slave, you are never allowed to own, operate, or touch a firearm. Punishable by death if you do. Very simple reason for this. If you are a slaveholder yourself, why would you want your slaves, or free blacks, to be able to arm themselves against you? It's a perceived threat. Number one fear in the South is armed insurrection of their slaves. Slave insurrection is the number one fear, and as such, safety precautions are taken against it. Ergo, slaves are not allowed to own or operate or touch firearms. Brown realizes this. You cannot give firearms, modern or past, into the hands of people who do not know how to use them. Case in point, I could hand an M16 to anyone here, and you may know how to operate it. You might know how to reload it. You may know how to fire it, but chances are you probably don't. And chances are you're probably, more likely than not, going to end up hurting yourself or your comrades far more easily than you would hurt the enemy. The same thing applies back then. Brown realizes this. Cannot arm slaves or free African Americans with these weapons without training them. But what to do? He must arm them with something. Well, a very simple reason. Everyone is ingrained in their mind somewhere along the human existence of how to use a sharpened stick. It's a base need, base nature. And as such, Brown hands out these iron pikes to these individuals. Now, Brown's raid ultimately was a military failure. Why was this the case? Well, very little went right. What ended up happening was Brown pushed into the South. Brown pushed into the Harper's Ferry Armory and Arsenal. The alarm got out. Word got out that something was going on. Now, people did not realize that it was Brown. They did not realize the purpose. They did not know that he was there to arm the slaves. All they knew simply was that someone was assaulting the armory and arsenal. And as such, 3,000 militiamen descended upon the town. Word gets all the way to Washington, D.C. to President Buchanan. Now, President Buchanan has to disperse someone. Who shall he disperse? The army. Well, they can't do that. The army is primarily all out west, settling Indian affairs, to put it politely. But there is a group of 90 U.S. Marines. So the Marines are dispatched to Harper's Ferry to quell this revolt. Brown retreats backwards, losing several of his men, including one of a man named Dangerfield Newby. Now, Dangerfield Newby was a free African American, but his wife and children were enslaved. He had recently received a note from his wife that said, "Dear Dangerfield, I want you to buy me as soon as you can. For it is said that master is in want of money, and I know not when he may sell me." And that is an interesting thing. Most people in this world, thankfully, will never have to know what it is like to have to purchase the freedom of one's family, of one's friends, of having to worry about if you cannot get up the money, what will happen to them. Newby sided with Brown, and it cost him his life. But not just his life, it cost him his dignity. For after Newby was shot dead that night, during that raid, during that 36 hours, as he was retreating backwards to the engine house, a central point pre-picked by Brown, the crowd, the angry mob, surrounds him, and they cut off his ears and sell them as souvenirs. Brown is surrounded by the 90 U.S. Marines. A 12-man Marine charging party comes forth, enters into the engine house. The 3.5-minute fight inside the engine house is a Marine victory. Brown loses and he is dragged out. His raid is a failure, or is it? Brown is taken to Charlestown. Severely wounded in the throat, he's put on trial. Now it is during this trial that Brown makes clear his action. You have to remember at this point, up until this point when Brown has been captured, no one knows that it's Brown. No one knows the purpose of the raid. People simply know that something is going on in Harper's Ferry. Well, all of a sudden, this great kerfuffle comes into the light, and people see the raid for what it really is. They find these 950 iron pikes. A man named Edmund Ruffin takes several of those pikes, describes them with what our northern brethren have in store for us, and send one to each southern governor. Now, Ruffin is what they call a southern fire eater, has been preaching secession for over 20 years. And Brown gives him his big moment in the sun. He proceeds to take one of those pikes, and he proceeds to march up and down the streets of Charlestown during Brown's trial, and he cries out, "This pike would have been made to gore your wife's belly in the dead of night." He wins several friends through this. Brown is tried. He's found guilty. And he's found guilty of 3 crimes: murder, treason against the state of Virginia, and inciting a slave revolt. Now, of those 3 crimes, only one of them is a mandatory death sentence. Is it murder? 4 people did die during the course of the raid. Is it treason? No. In 1859, in the state of Virginia, you can kill 4 people, but they won't necessarily hang you for that. You can commit treason against that state, whether or not you are a citizen of that state. Because Brown was a citizen of Connecticut, of New York, of Ohio. He'd even lived in Kansas. He had never lived or resided legally or in any other format in the state of Virginia. He's found guilty of it. But if you were found guilty of treason in the state of Virginia, they won't necessarily hang you for that either. But if you try to incite the slaves to rebel against their white masters, to take their freedom by force of arms, they will hang you without a second thought. And that's exactly what they did. Brown went to the gallows on December 2nd of 1859. Now, he said nothing from the gallows. He had no formal last words. But he did pen a note. And that note read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood." Very peculiar thing to say. 12 months after Brown is hanged, December 20th of 1860, South Carolina secedes from the Union, following the election of Abraham Lincoln. 16 months later, April 12th, 4:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, the Civil War erupts. 4 years after the Civil War erupts, everything Brown was fighting for comes to fruition. The freedom of 4 million people by force of arms. Now, there are those that say the Civil War began 4:30 a.m. with the pulling of a lanyard in anger against the United States government, with the firing at Fort Sumter. And there are those that say, in fact, that the war did not begin at Fort Sumter. The war began in the engine house. The war began in the streets. The war began in the arsenal and armory of Harper's Ferry. And the war began with John Brown.